Sarah Mitchell smoothed her crisp white uniform and took a deep breath before pressing the doorbell of the imposing Victorian mansion. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and somewhere in the distance, a blackbird sang its morning song. At 32, she had spent the past decade working as a nurse in London's busiest hospitals, but this private care position promised to be unlike anything she'd experienced before. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing Helena Blackwood, a striking woman in her mid-40s wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Her platinum blonde hair was swept into an immaculate chignon, and her steel-grey eyes assessed Sarah with barely concealed disdain. "You must be the new nurse," Helena said, her voice as cold as winter frost. "Come in. I trust the agency briefed you about the confidentiality agreement." Sarah nodded, clutching her medical bag closer. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. I've signed all the necessary paperwork." The interior of the house was a testament to wealth and refined taste, with crystal chandeliers, antique furniture, and original artwork adorning every wall. Yet despite its grandeur, there was something distinctly unlived in about the space, as if it were more museum than home. Helena led Sarah up a sweeping staircase, her heels clicking against the marble steps. "My husband, Alexander, requires round-the-clock care following his accident 3 months ago. The previous nurses," she paused, her lips tightening, "they weren't up to our standards." Sarah had heard whispers about the Blackwood case, a brilliant businessman now confined to his bed after a devastating car accident. The medical reports she'd reviewed painted a challenging picture: minimal responsiveness, limited mobility, and a poor prognosis for recovery. They reached a door at the end of a long hallway, and Helena's hand hesitated on the handle. "I should warn you, his condition can be unsettling for those unused to such cases." The master bedroom was spacious and bright, with large windows, overlooking the sprawling gardens below. Medical equipment had been seamlessly integrated into the luxurious setting, but Sarah's attention was immediately drawn to the man in the bed. Alexander Blackwood bore little resemblance to the confident figure she'd seen in newspaper photographs. His once powerful frame seemed smaller somehow, his skin pale against the Egyptian cotton sheets. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at some point beyond the ceiling. "I'll leave you to get acquainted with your duties," Helena said, already turning towards the door. "The previous nurse's notes are on the desk. If you need anything, speak with Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper. I have meetings in the city." Sarah waited until Helena's footsteps faded before approaching her patient. She pulled up a chair beside the bed and opened her medical bag, retrieving her stethoscope. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said warmly, as if speaking to any other patient. "I'm Sarah, and I'll be taking care of you from now on. I hope you don't mind if I check your vital signs." As she worked, she continued speaking softly, describing each action before she performed it. There was no response, but Sarah hadn't expected one. What caught her attention, however, was the state of his muscles. Despite his condition, there was less atrophy than she would have anticipated after 3 months of immobility. Sarah spent the morning reviewing his medical history and previous care notes. The more she read, the more her professional concern grew. The basic medical care had been adequate, but there was no evidence of any rehabilitation attempts, no record of physical therapy or stimulation exercises. She glanced at Alexander, noting how his eyes occasionally tracked the movement of dust, motes in the sunbeams. These tiny movements might seem insignificant to others, but to Sarah they were precious indicators of potential. By lunchtime, she had drafted a comprehensive care plan. It would be challenging, particularly given Mrs. Blackwood's apparent detachment, but Sarah had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She'd graduated top of her class while raising her daughter alone, had worked double shifts to put herself through specialized training courses, and had never given up on a patient. Looking at Alexander's blank expression, Sarah felt a familiar determination rising within her. "We're going to try something different, Mr. Blackwood," she said, pulling out her notebook. "I believe you're still in there, and I'm going to help you find your way back." Over the next few weeks, Sarah implemented her new care regime with unwavering dedication. Each morning began with gentle exercises to maintain muscle tone, followed by reading sessions where she shared news from the financial papers knowing Alexander's previous interest in business. She noted every minor response. A slight finger twitch when she mentioned his company's latest acquisition, the way his breathing changed during certain musical pieces she played during therapy sessions. These subtle signs might have seemed insignificant to others, but to Sarah, they were breadcrumbs leading towards recovery. One particularly warm afternoon, as Sarah was adjusting Alexander's position, she noticed his eyes following something outside the window. A sleek Russian blue cat was perched on a nearby branch, its silver-grey coat gleaming in the sunlight. "Do you like cats, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, watching his face carefully. For a moment something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps even longing. Later that day, Sarah discovered from Mrs. Harris that Alexander had once owned a Russian Blue, a beloved pet that had vanished shortly before his accident. The discovery led Sarah to make an unconventional decision. That weekend, she visited a local animal shelter and found a Russian blue cat in need of a home. The shelter worker explained that the cat, whom they'd named Winston, had been rescued from the streets but was remarkably well behaved. When Sarah brought Winston to the mansion the following Monday, Helena's reaction was predictably frosty. "This is highly irregular," she said, her arms crossed. "A medical facility is no place for animals." "Actually," Sarah countered politely but firmly, "pet therapy has shown remarkable results in rehabilitation cases. I've brought all the relevant research papers for your review." She'd spent Sunday night preparing a comprehensive presentation, complete with peer-reviewed studies and success stories. Helena's lips tightened, but she couldn't argue with the scientific evidence. "Very well, but if it interferes with his care in any way—" "It won't," Sarah assured her. "I'll take full responsibility." The moment Winston was introduced to Alexander's room, something magical happened. The cat immediately jumped onto the bed and curled up beside Alexander's hand. To Sarah's amazement, Alexander's fingers twitched, then slowly, ever so slowly, moved to touch Winston's fur. It was the first voluntary movement she'd seen from him. Sarah quickly documented the EE response, her heart racing with excitement. "That's wonderful, Mr. Blackwood," she encouraged, keeping her voice calm despite her internal jubilation. "Can you try to move your fingers again?" The movement was minimal, just a slight flexing of his fingers against Winston's fur, but it was intentional. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon working with him, using Winston's presence as motivation for further movement exercises. That evening, as Sarah was preparing to leave, she heard something that made her freeze in her tracks, a sound barely audible coming from Alexander's lips. She turned back to the bed, hardly daring to breathe. "Did you try to say something, Mr. Blackwood?" His lips moved again, and this time she could make out a single word: "Win." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, that's right. Winston, he's here with you." She stayed late that night, documenting every detail of the breakthrough. As she wrote her notes, Winston remained curled up against Alexander, purring contentedly, while Alexander's fingers continued their slight but deliberate movement against the cat's fur. When Helena returned from her latest business trip, Sarah presented her with the day's progress report. "He spoke today, Mrs. Blackwood. Just one word, but it's a start." Helena's expression was difficult to read. "I see," she said after a long pause. "Well, keep me informed of any further developments." She turned to leave, then hesitated. "Miss Mitchell?" "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood." "The cat can stay." Sarah smiled as she watched Helena's retreating back. It wasn't much, but it was progress on multiple fronts. As she returned to Alexander's room, she found him asleep, one hand still resting on Winston's fur, his face more peaceful than she'd ever seen it. "Small steps," she whispered, adjusting his blanket. "We'll get there, Mr. Blackwood, one small step at a time." Sarah's daily routine at the Blackwood mansion had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning she arrived just as the sun painted the sky in soft pastels, bringing fresh hope and determination with her. Alexander's progress, though slow, was steady. He could now form simple words, and his hand coordination had improved enough to grasp a spoon, albeit with considerable effort. One rainy afternoon, as Sarah was sorting through Alexander's medical supplies in the adjacent study, she discovered a leather-bound journal tucked behind some files. The elegant monogram AB on its cover caught her attention. Her professional ethics warred briefly with her instinct that any insight into Alexander's past could aid his recovery. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the journal. The entries, dated back to just before his accident, written in a strong, confident hand. As she read, a complex picture emerged of a man who'd felt increasingly isolated despite his wealth and success. The last entry, dated the day before his accident, made her breath catch. Helena wants to discuss something important tomorrow. She's been distant lately, preoccupied. I fear I know what's coming. A sudden noise made Sarah snap the journal shut. Helena stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Finding anything interesting, Miss Mitchell? Sarah straightened, holding the journal. I apologize, Mrs. Blackwood. I was looking for medical supplies and found this. I thought it might help understand Mr. Blackwood's state of mind before the accident. His state of mind? Helena's laugh was brittle. Alexander was perfectly fine before the accident. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for a board meeting. But Sarah had caught something in Helena's eyes, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, or fear. Before she could ponder it further, a crash from Alexander's room sent them both rushing to investigate. They found Winston on the floor beside a fallen water glass, but it was Alexander who commanded their attention. His face was contorted with effort, and he was trying to form words. Helena, he managed, his voice rough from disuse. Need talk. Helena's face paled. He's confused, she said quickly. The accident affected his memory. But Sarah noticed how Alexander's eyes tracked his wife's movements with newfound clarity. There was recognition there and something else, an urgent need to communicate. That evening, after Helena had left and Alexander was resting, Sarah sat with him during his evening exercises. Mr. Blackwood, she said gently, can you tell me what you were trying to say to your wife? His fingers twitched against the bedsheet and his brow furrowed with concentration. He struggled with each word. She wanted... end... Sarah's heart raced as she pieced together his fragmented speech. Was he suggesting that Helena had wanted to end their marriage before the accident? The journal entry suddenly took on new significance. As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander became agitated, his breathing labored. Sarah quickly shifted into nurse mode, helping him relax through the breathing exercises they'd practiced. It's all right, she soothed. We don't have to discuss it now. You've made amazing progress today. That night, as Sarah drove home to her small flat where her teenage daughter Emma waited, her mind whirled with questions. The dynamic between Alexander and Helena seemed more complicated than she'd initially assumed. And now, with Alexander's memory and speech slowly returning, she sensed they were approaching a crucial turning point. Emma greeted her with a hug and the smell of slightly burnt pasta. Mum, you look worried. Is your patient okay? Sarah managed to smile. He's improving, darling. It's just, sometimes helping people get better means uncovering truths they might not be ready to face. Later, lying awake in bed, Sarah remembered the look in Alexander's eyes when he'd tried to speak to Helena. There had been pain there, yes, but also determination. Whatever had happened before his accident, Alexander was fighting his way back not just to physical health, but to confront something from his past. Sarah pulled out her notebook and began updating her care plan. Tomorrow, she would begin new exercises focusing on speech therapy and memory tasks. If Alexander was ready to communicate, she would help him find his voice, whatever truths it might reveal. The following weeks brought a flurry of changes to the Blackwood mansion. Alexander's progress accelerated, each day bringing new achievements. His speech, though still halting, grew clearer, and his physical strength improved steadily through Sarah's dedicated therapy sessions. Helena's visits to the mansion became increasingly rare, each appearance briefer than the last. She cited board meetings and business obligations, but Sarah noticed how she avoided being alone with Alexander, especially during his more lucid moments. One crisp morning, Sarah arrived to find Mrs. Harris, the housekeeper, in a state of excitement. "He's asking for his office, dear," she whispered. "First thing this morning, clear as day, he asked to see his study." Sarah's heart leapt at this development, but she maintained her professional composure. "Let's see how he manages the journey," she said, already mentally planning the safest route through the house. With careful support and a wheelchair for backup, Sarah helped Alexander navigate the corridor to his study. His steps were unsteady but determined. Winston trotted alongside them, his tail held high like a proud guardian. The study remained, exactly as it had been before the accident. Helena had insisted nothing be touched. Alexander's eyes roamed the room, taking in the familiar surroundings. His hand trembled as he reached for his desk. "Would you like to sit in your chair, Mr. Blackwood?" Sarah asked, noting how his gaze fixed on the leather executive chair. He nodded and with Sarah's help settled into the seat. His fingers traced the smooth wood of the desk, muscle memory awakening as he found the power button for his computer. "Sarah," he said, his voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. "Look something." She watched as he slowly typed his password, muscle memory again coming to his aid. His determination was palpable as he navigated through folders, occasionally pausing to rest his shaking hands. Finally, he found what he was searching for. A video file dated the day before his accident. His finger hovered over the play button as he turned to Sarah. "Please, under watch." The video showed Alexander's office, captured by what appeared to be a security camera. Helena entered, perfectly poised as always. The conversation that followed was brief but intense. Though the audio was muffled, certain phrases rang clear. "I can't do this anymore, Alexander. The company isn't enough. I want a divorce." Sarah watched Alexander's face as the scene played out. His expression remained calm, but his hands gripped the armrests tightly. "She didn't expect," he managed. "Accident. Next day." Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in as she noticed signs of stress in his vital signs. "Perhaps we should return to your room, Mr. Blackwood. You've accomplished quite a lot today." But Alexander shook his head. With visible effort, he opened another file, a legal document. Sarah caught glimpses of phrases like charitable foundation and estate planning. "My Q plans," he explained, "before to everything. Help people." Sarah began to understand. Before the accident, Alexander had been planning to direct his fortune toward charitable causes. Had Helena known? Was this why? A noise in the doorway made them both turn. Helena stood there, her face ashen. Her eyes darted from Alexander to the computer screen and back. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "He shouldn't be out of bed. This is completely inappropriate, Miss Mitchell." But Alexander's voice, though quiet, cut through her protests. "My choice. Helena. My life." The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah moved slightly closer to Alexander, ready to support him if needed. Winston, sensing the atmosphere, pressed against Alexander's legs protectively. Helena's lips trembled. "You don't understand. You're not well enough to make decisions. The doctors said—" "I understand everything," Alexander interrupted, each word carefully formed, "including why you stayed." The silence that followed was deafening. Helena's designer handbag slipped from her fingers, landing with a soft thud on the carpet. Without another word, she turned and fled the room, her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway. Sarah knelt beside Alexander's chair, checking his pulse. "Are you all right?" That was quite an emotional moment. He turned to her, and for the first time she saw a smile, small but genuine, transform his face. "Better than all right," he said. "Feel awake. Finally awake." The days following the confrontation in Alexander's study brought significant changes to the household. Helena retreated to their London townhouse, leaving only terse messages with Mrs. Harris about board meetings and business obligations. Meanwhile, Alexander threw himself into his rehabilitation with renewed vigor, as if the weight of unspoken truths had been lifting from his shoulders. Sarah expanded their therapy sessions, introducing more challenging exercises. She couldn't help but notice how Alexander's determination seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. His voice, though still struggling with complex sentences, carried more confidence. One afternoon, as autumn sunlight streamed through the study windows, Alexander insisted on reviewing his charitable foundation plans. Sarah sat nearby, ready to assist if needed, while Winston dozed in a patch of sunshine. "I had dreams," Alexander explained, his fingers steady as he scrolled through documents. "Build centers, rehabilitation, help others, like me." Sarah watched him navigate through the files with growing confidence. "That's a wonderful vision, Mr. Blackwood. There's certainly a need for more specialized rehabilitation facilities." He turned to her, his eyes clear and focused. "Sarah, please call me Alexander." The intimacy of the moment caught her off guard. She'd maintained professional distance all these months, but something had shifted between them, subtle yet undeniable. Before she could respond, Mrs. Harris appeared at the door, looking flustered. "Miss Mitchell, there's someone here from St. Margaret's Hospital to see you. Says it's urgent." The visitor turned out to be Dr. James Wellington, head of rehabilitation services at one of London's most prestigious private hospitals. He'd heard about Alexander's remarkable progress and had a proposition for Sarah. "We're expanding our rehabilitation unit," he explained, seated in the mansion's formal sitting room. "Your innovative approaches, particularly your work with Mr. Blackwood, have caught our attention. We'd like to offer you a position as head of our new research program." Sarah's heart raced. It was the kind of opportunity she'd dreamed of, a chance to implement her methods on a larger scale to help more patients. The salary would ensure Emma's university education. Yet, the thought of leaving Alexander's care filled her with an unexpected sadness. "I'll need time to consider it," she said carefully. Dr. Wellington nodded. "Of course, though I should mention, the position would include 6 months of specialized training in Switzerland. We'd need you to start within the next few weeks." Later that evening, as Sarah helped Alexander with his evening exercises, she found herself watching him more intently than usual. His movements were stronger now, his face more animated. She'd grown accustomed to the small signs that showed his mood, the slight furrow of his brow when concentrating, the subtle smile when Winston did something amusing. "Something wrong?" he asked, catching her distracted expression. Sarah hesitated. "I received a job offer today from St. Margaret's Hospital." Alexander's hand stilled on the exercise band. "You leaving?" "I haven't decided yet," she said quickly. "It's a research position. 6 months in Switzerland, then running their new rehabilitation program." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. Alexander resumed his exercises, his movements more mechanical than before. "You should take it," he finally said, though his voice carried an edge of strain. "Good opportunity." Sarah started to respond, but movement in the doorway caught her attention. Helena stood there, wearing an expression Sarah had never seen before, something almost like triumph. "Oh, how perfect," Helena said, her voice silky smooth. "You must take it, Miss Mitchell. We can certainly find another nurse for Alexander, someone more appropriate for long-term care." The emphasis she placed on appropriate made Sarah's spine stiffen. Before she could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the tension. "My care. My choice," he stated firmly. Helena's smile didn't waver. "Darling, you're still recovering. Such decisions should be left to those who have your best interests at heart. I've already contacted an excellent care facility in Switzerland. Their methods are quite traditional." Sarah watched Alexander's face pale slightly at the mention of a care facility. His next words came slowly, deliberately clear. "I'm staying here in my home." "We'll discuss this later," Helena said, turning to leave. "When you're thinking more clearly." After she left, Sarah noticed Alexander's hands trembling slightly. Without thinking, she reached out and steadied them with her own. "I won't let her send you away," she said softly. "We've come too far." Alexander's fingers curled around hers, warm and sure. "Then don't go," he whispered. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, feeling the weight of the moment. She'd built her career on professional distance, on making decisions based on medical necessity rather than emotional attachment. But watching Alexander's hard-won progress, Understanding the depth of his fears about being institutionalized, she realized this had become more than just another case. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room as they sat incompanionable. Silence, Winston purring softly nearby, while Sarah grappled with a decision that would change not just her future, but Alexander's as well. Sarah spent the weekend in turmoil, weighing her options while trying to maintain her professional composure at work. Emma, perceptive as always, noticed her distraction during their Sunday dinner. "Mum, you've hardly touched your shepherd's pie," Emma observed, pushing her own plate aside. "Is this about the job offer?" Sarah smiled weakly at her daughter's insight. "Partly it's an amazing opportunity, but you're worried about Mr. Blackwood," Emma finished. "You know, you light up when you talk about his progress. I haven't seen you this passionate about your work since, well, ever." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Harris. "Come quickly. Something's wrong." The drive to the mansion felt endless. Sarah found Alexander in his study, attempting to stand without support. His face was drawn with pain, his shirt damp with sweat. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to his side. "Tried. Walking. Alone," he admitted, grimacing. "Needed to prove. Could do it." Sarah helped him back into his chair, quickly assessing his condition. No serious harm done, but he'd clearly pushed himself too hard. "Why would you risk this? We have a schedule for a reason." His next words came out in a rush, as if he'd been practicing them. "Can't be helpless again if you leave." The raw vulnerability in his voice made her heart clench. As she began their usual recovery exercises, a commotion downstairs drew their attention. Helena's voice carried up the stairs, accompanied by unfamiliar footsteps. "This way, Dr. Chen. I'm so grateful you could come on such short notice." A distinguished-looking man in his 60s appeared in the doorway, followed by Helena and another man carrying medical equipment. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Chen said smoothly, "I'm here to evaluate your condition. Your wife has concerns about your current care regime." Sarah straightened, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the sudden intrusion. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Mr. Blackwood's primary nurse. All of his progress reports and medical records are up to date." "Yes, well," Helena interrupted. "Given recent events, we feel a full evaluation is necessary. Perhaps you could give us some privacy, Miss Mitchell." Alexander's hand shot out, gripping Sarah's wrist. "She stays." What followed was a thorough examination, during which Dr. Chen made numerous notes while wearing an increasingly troubled expression. Finally, he turned to Helena. "Mrs. Blackwood, might I speak with you privately?" They left the room, but their voices carried through the partially open door. "His progress is remarkable," Dr. Chen was saying. "Far beyond what we typically see in cases like this. Miss Mitchell's methods, while unconventional, appear to be extremely effective." "But surely you see my concerns," Helena's voice took, on an edge of desperation. "He's making irrational decisions, trying to alter legal documents." "Mrs. Blackwood," the doctor's voice was firm, "your husband shows no signs of cognitive impairment. His decision-making capabilities appear quite sound." When they returned, Helena's composure had slipped noticeably. She grabbed her handbag, muttering something about appointments, and practically fled the room. After Dr. Chen left, Sarah helped Alexander with his evening routine, her mind racing with the day's events. As she adjusted his pillows, he caught her hand. "Stay," he said simply. Sarah sat beside him, their fingers still entwined. "Alexander, not just tonight," he clarified. "Stay here, with me." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Sarah thought about Emma's words, about the passion she'd found in this work. She thought about the research position, the prestige it offered. Then she looked at Alexander, saw the hope and fear warring in his eyes, and knew her decision had already been made. "What about your wife?" she asked softly. Alexander's expression hardened slightly. "Papers, being prepared. Lawyer coming tomorrow." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by Winston's contented purring from his spot at the foot of the bed. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Sarah thought about crossroads and choices, about the paths that lead us to unexpected destinations. She thought about her daughter's insight about the way her work here had become more than just a job. "I'll stay," she whispered, feeling Alexander's hand tighten gratefully around hers. "We'll continue your recovery together." His smile, warm and genuine, lit up his entire face. In that moment, Sarah knew she'd made the right choice. Professional. Consequences be damned. Sometimes she realized the bravest thing you can do is follow your heart. News of Sarah's decision to decline the St. Margaret's position spread quickly through London's medical community. Dr. Wellington had been disappointed but understanding, though his parting words lingered in Sarah's mind. Sometimes the hardest choices are the most rewarding ones. The autumn days grew shorter, but Alexander's progress continued to exceed expectations. He could now walk short distances without support, and his speech had improved significantly. Each morning, Sarah arrived to find him already awake, eager to begin their therapy sessions. One particularly foggy morning, Sarah entered the study to find Alexander engaged in an intense phone conversation. His voice was clearer than she'd ever heard it. "No, Richard. Yes, I'm quite sure the foundation plans remain unchanged." He noticed Sarah and gestured for her to stay. "In fact, I want to accelerate the timeline." "Yes, I understand the implications." After ending the call, Alexander turned to Sarah, his expression determined. "My lawyer," he explained. "Foundation paperwork, nearly ready, but Helena's solicitor, causing delays." Sarah helped him sort through the mounting paperwork on his desk. "She's contesting the divorce?" "Not exactly." Alexander's face darkened. "Trying to claim I'm not competent, want control of everything." Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Harris burst into the study, her usually calm demeanor shattered. "Miss Mitchell, you need to see this immediately." She thrust a tablet into Sarah's hands. On the screen was an article from a prominent medical journal describing a groundbreaking rehabilitation case. Sarah's methods with Alexander were detailed extensively, but the article credited Dr. Chen and Helena Blackwood for the innovative approach. "They've stolen your work," Mrs. Harris said, indignant. "Every technique, every breakthrough, they're claiming it was all part of their treatment plan." Sarah's hands trembled as she read further. The article announced the opening of a new rehabilitation center funded by the Blackwood fortune, with Helena as the primary benefactor and Dr. Chen as medical director. Alexander's face had gone pale with fury. "They won't let them—" "Shh," Sarah soothed, noticing his increased agitation. "Your recovery is what matters now. We'll handle this." But the situation deteriorated rapidly. By afternoon, reporters had gathered at the mansion gates demanding interviews about the miraculous Blackwood recovery method. Helena had scheduled a press conference for the following day, presumably to announce the new center. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, some congratulatory, others questioning. Even Emma called from school, worried about the sudden media attention. "I'm fine, darling," Sarah assured her daughter. "Just focus on your studies. I'll sort this out." As evening approached, Alexander insisted on reviewing all his legal documents. His determination was palpable as he worked with Richard, his lawyer, via video call. "The foundation, my legacy," he told Sarah during a break, "won't let her twist it." Sarah watched him work, noting how far he'd come from the unresponsive patient she'd first met. His hands were steady now as he signed documents, his voice growing stronger with each passing hour. The night grew late, but neither of them noticed, until Winston jumped onto the desk, demanding attention. Sarah realized they'd missed dinner entirely. "We should get you some rest," she said, standing to help Alexander back to his room. He caught her hand, his grip firm. "Sarah, thank you for everything." Their eyes met and something electric passed between them. The air felt charged with unspoken words and possibilities. A sharp knock shattered the moment. Helena stood in the doorway, her perfect composure showing cracks around the edges. "I thought I might find you both here," she said, her voice brittle. "Working late again, Miss Mitchell. So dedicated to your patient. One might almost think there was more to it. Alexander started to speak, but Helena cut him off. The board meets tomorrow. They're quite interested in my plans for the new rehabilitation center. Your techniques will help so many people, Miss Mitchell. Shame you won't be part of it. Those aren't your techniques, Alexander said, his voice hard with anger. Helena's smile was cold. No, the doctors all seem to think they are. And really, darling, who will they believe? Your devoted wife who's supported you through this difficult time, or a nurse who's grown perhaps too attached to her wealthy patient? Sarah felt her professional reputation crumbling around her, but she held her ground. The truth will come out, Mrs. Blackwood. The truth? Helena laughed softly. The truth is you've compromised your professional ethics, getting emotionally involved with a patient, refusing better opportunities to stay here. The medical board might have something to say about that. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Miss Mitchell, consider this your official notice. Your services will no longer be required after tomorrow. I'm sure you understand, given the circumstances. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Sarah stood frozen, feeling the weight of Helena's threat settle around her shoulders. Alexander's voice broke through her thoughts. We won't let her win. Sarah looked at him, saw the strength and determination in his eyes, and felt her resolve steady. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning of Helena's press conference dawned grey and drizzly, matching the tension that filled the mansion. Sarah arrived early, finding Alexander already dressed and waiting in his study. His determination was evident in every line of his body. Ready? She asked, setting down her medical bag. He nodded, his voice stronger than ever. Richard's bringing the documents, everything we need. They had worked late into the night preparing their response to Helena's plans. Alexander had insisted on documenting every step of his recovery, every technique Sarah had developed. Mrs. Harris had contributed her own detailed records of the daily routine and progress. The mansion's driveway filled with cars as board members and journalists arrived for Helena's announcement. From the study window, they watched her greet, everyone with practice charm, every hair in place, her designer suit immaculate. She always was and perfect at appearances, Alexander said softly. Sarah squeezed his shoulder gently. Appearances aren't everything. The press conference was set up in the mansion's grand reception room. Helena had arranged everything carefully, from the lighting to the strategic placement of medical equipment as props. Dr. Chen stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but committed to his role. Sarah and Alexander watched the proceedings on the study's television screen. Helena was in her element, describing her vision for the new rehabilitation center. When my beloved husband had his accident, she said, her voice catching perfectly on cue, I knew we had to find a better way. The techniques we developed... A commotion at the back of the room interrupted her speech. Richard, Alexander's lawyer, entered with a thick folder under his arm. Behind him came two members of the medical board. I believe, Richard's voice carried clearly through the room, that you'll all want to see this before proceeding. Helena's composure slipped slightly. This is hardly the time. Actually, a new voice joined in, this is exactly the time. Sarah turned to find Alexander standing in the study doorway, leaning slightly on his cane, but otherwise steady. Shall we join them? He asked her. Together they made their way downstairs. The assembled crowd parted as they entered, whispers rippling through the room. Helena's face had lost all color. Alexander, darling, you should be resting. No? More lies, Helena. His voice was clear and strong. Show them the truth. Richard began distributing documents, Sarah's original treatment plans dated and notarized, Mrs. Harris's daily logs, video recordings of therapy sessions showing Sarah's innovative techniques. Furthermore, Richard addressed the stunned audience. I have here Mrs. Blackwood's original divorce petition, filed the day before Mr. Blackwood's accident, along with recent attempts to gain control of his estate by claiming medical incompetence. The medical board members were already reviewing the evidence, their expressions growing increasingly grave. Dr. Chen had backed away from Helena, his professional reputation visibly crumbling before their eyes. "I can explain," Helena started, but Alexander cut her off. "You wanted end our marriage, fine, but stealing Sarah's work and trying to take Foundation, that ends now." A board member stepped forward. "Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Chen, I suggest we continue this discussion at the PI board office immediately." Helena's carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. She turned to Alexander, her mask finally cracking completely. "You would choose her, after everything we built together?" "No, Helena," Alexander replied quietly. "I choose truth, choose helping people, the right way." The room erupted in camera flashes and questions as Helena was led away. Sarah felt Alexander sway slightly beside her and instantly steadied him. "Perhaps we should return upstairs," she suggested softly. He nodded, but before they could move, a young journalist broke through the crowd. "Mr. Blackwood, will you tell us about your plans for the Rehabilitation Foundation?" Alexander looked at Sarah, a smile touching his lips. "Yes, but first, proper credit. Meet Sarah Mitchell, the real innovator." Later, in the quiet of the study, Sarah and Alexander watched the media coverage unfold on the television. The truth had emerged. Helena's schemes exposed, Sarah's techniques properly credited, and Alexander's foundation plans revealed. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, absently stroking Winston, who had claimed his usual spot between them. Alexander reached for her hand. "Begin again. Together? Foundation needs medical director." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. After all the chaos and uncertainty, the path forward suddenly seemed clear. Not just as nurse and patient, not just as colleagues, but as partners in every sense. "Together," she agreed, squeezing his hand. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunshine broke through the clouds. A new day was beginning, full of possibilities they would face side by side. The weeks following Helena's departure brought a whirlwind of changes to the Blackwood mansion. The media storm gradually subsided, replaced by a steady stream of medical professionals and foundation planners. Alexander's study had become the hub of activity, with blueprints for the new rehabilitation center spread across his desk. Sarah found herself juggling her roles as Alexander's nurse, medical consultant, and now prospective director of rehabilitation services. The transition felt natural, yet sometimes overwhelming. One morning, as autumn painted the garden in rich golds and crimsons, Sarah arrived to find Alexander already in the garden, practicing his walking exercises independently. "You're getting stronger every day," she observed, watching his steady progress along the gravel path. He turned to her, smiling. "Strong enough for board meeting today?" Sarah checked her watch. "The foundation board meeting isn't until afternoon. We have time for your regular therapy first." "No therapy today," he replied, his eyes twinkling. "Different plans." Before she could question him further, Mrs. Harris appeared with Emma in tow. Sarah's daughter was grinning broadly, carrying a large portfolio case. "Emma, shouldn't you be in school?" "Mr. Blackwood asked me to help with something special," Emma explained, practically bouncing with excitement. "Can we show her now?" Alexander nodded, gesturing toward the garden pavilion where breakfast had been laid out. As they settled around the table, Emma opened her portfolio, revealing detailed sketches of what appeared to be interior designs. "The rehabilitation center needs personal touch," Alexander explained. "Emma has artistic talent." Sarah looked through the drawings with growing amazement. Her daughter had created warm, inviting spaces that perfectly balanced medical functionality with comfortable aesthetics. Each room featured large windows, natural materials, and clever adaptations for patients with varying mobility levels. "These are extraordinary," Sarah breathed, watching Emma's face light up with pride. "But when did you—" "I've been visiting after school," Emma admitted. "Mr. Blackwood said the center should feel like home, not a hospital. He told me about your techniques, how you used Winston to help with his recovery, and we thought maybe we could have a therapy animal program too." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. While she'd been focused on the medical aspects of the foundation, Alexander had been quietly involving her daughter in creating something truly special. "There's more," Emma said, pulling out another sketch. "We designed a special apartment above the center for the medical director." She paused, glancing between Sarah and Alexander and her family. Sarah's breath caught. The implications of the design, space for both her and Emma, a home within the center itself, spoke volumes about Alexander's hopes for their future. "Too presumptuous?" Alexander asked softly, watching her reaction. She shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she managed, "It's perfect, all of it." The rest of breakfast passed in animated discussion about the center's plans. Emma's enthusiasm was infectious, and Sarah found herself caught up in their shared vision of what the foundation could become. As Emma packed up her sketches, preparing to head to her afternoon classes, she hugged Sarah tightly. "I like it here, Mum," she whispered. "I like who we're becoming." After Emma left, Sarah and Alexander walked slowly through the garden. Winston trotted ahead of them, occasionally pausing to investigate interesting scents. "You've been planning this all along?" Sarah asked. Alexander nodded. "Wanted to show you future possibilities, not just work, but family." They reached the old rose garden, where late blooms still offered splashes of color against the autumn foliage. Alexander turned to face her, his movements more confident than she'd ever seen. "Sarah," he began, his voice clear and steady, "these months you gave me back my life, not just physical recovery, but purpose, meaning." She started to protest, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. Practice this speech." Taking a deep breath, he continued, "I'm not offering job, offering partnership. In foundation, in life, in everything, if you want." Sarah looked at this man who had fought his way back from the brink, who had shown such kindness to her daughter, who saw her not just as a nurse but as an equal. The answer was simple. "Yes," she said softly. "To everything." A rustle in the nearby shrubbery made them both turn. Winston emerged, proudly carrying a small velvet box in his mouth. Alexander laughed at Sarah's surprised expression. "Trained?" "Hymns all week." Emma helped. As Sarah opened the box to reveal a stunning sapphire ring, she realized that sometimes the best rehabilitation stories weren't just about physical recovery, but about hearts healing and lives being rebuilt. One careful step at a time. The transformation of the old Victorian hospital into the Blackwood Rehabilitation Centre progressed rapidly as winter settled over London. Sarah found herself at the heart of a project that exceeded her wildest dreams, combining her innovative techniques with state-of-the-art facilities. Emma had thrown herself into the role of unofficial design consultant, spending weekends with the interior decorators and suggesting thoughtful touches that would make patients feel more at home. Her latest project involved creating a winter garden where patients could enjoy nature year-round. One snowy morning, Sarah stood with Alexander in what would become the center's main rehabilitation room. The space was still under construction, but Emma's vision was already taking shape. Warm wood floors, large windows, and cleverly disguised medical equipment that made the room feel more like a wellness studio than a hospital ward. "Ready for the board presentation?" Alexander asked, his speech now almost completely normal, though he still occasionally paused between complex sentences. Sarah nodded, reviewing her notes one last time. They were presenting their complete treatment methodology. Today, including the integration of therapy animals, arts programs, and family involvement in the recovery process. "I never imagined this," she admitted, gesturing to the space around them. "When I first walked into your mansion that morning, I was just hoping to help one patient." Alexander smiled, taking her hand. "Instead, you'll help thousands." He touched the sapphire ring on her finger, a gesture that had become habit. "Meeting today, then dinner? Emma's cooking." Sarah laughed. "Heaven help us. Remember her last attempt at lasagna? Ordered backup, just in case," he whispered conspiratorially. The board meeting exceeded their expectations. The members were particularly impressed by the preliminary results from their pilot program, which had already helped several patients using Sarah's methods. The integration of therapy animals, inspired by Winston's role in Alexander's recovery, had proven especially successful. As they presented the final phase of their plans, Sarah couldn't help but notice how naturally she and Alexander complemented each other. Where she provided the medical expertise, he handled the business aspects. When she detailed treatment protocols, he explained funding structures. They moved through their presentation like a well-choreographed dance. Later that evening, as promised, Emma served her latest culinary experiment, a somewhat unconventional take on shepherd's pie. They sat in the kitchen of their new apartment above the center, Winston hopeful for scraps beneath the table. "I have news," Emma announced between bites. "I've decided what I want to study at university." Sarah set down her fork. "Oh?" "Occupational therapy," Emma said firmly. "Working with you and Mr. Blackwood, Alexander, I've seen how much difference it makes. I want to be part of that." Alexander reached across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. "Already part of it. Your designs make difference." Sarah watched them, her heart full. The past year had brought changes she could never have anticipated. A new home, a new family configuration, a chance to revolutionize rehabilitation therapy. The ring on her finger caught the light, reminding her of how far they'd all come. After dinner, they walked through the nearly completed center. Most of the construction crews had gone home, leaving the building peaceful and full of possibility. Their footsteps echoed on the new floors as they showed Emma the latest developments. "Look," Emma said suddenly, pointing out a window. "First, patients arrive next week, right? We should have this ready for them." She led them to the winter garden, her pet project. Despite the snow outside, the space was warm and inviting, filled with plants and comfortable seating areas. A small fountain provided gentle background noise, and subtle lighting created a calming atmosphere. "Perfect place for recovery," Alexander approved, watching Emma beam with pride. Sarah wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Well, almost everything," Emma replied with a mischievous smile. "Still need to finish planning your wedding. June in the garden, remember?" Sarah felt Alexander's arm slip around her waist, and she leaned into him slightly. "June seems so far away," she murmured. "Worth waiting for," he replied softly. "Like all good things." Through the glass ceiling, stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. Sarah thought about the long journey that had brought them here, from that first morning at the mansion to this moment, standing in the center that represented their shared vision for the future. Emma's voice broke through her reverie. "Oh, I almost forgot. Winston's new friend arrives tomorrow. The Therapy Cat program coordinator found another Russian blue. They think she'll be perfect for pediatric rehabilitation." Alexander chuckled. "Winston sure needs girlfriend." As if on cue, Winston appeared, winding between their legs, before settling on one of Emma's carefully chosen benches. He looked entirely at home, as if he'd been waiting for them to create this space all along. Sarah looked at her unlikely family, her brilliant daughter, her soon-to-be husband who had fought so hard to rebuild his life, and the cat who had helped bring them all together. Sometimes, she realized, the best rehabilitation stories weren't just about physical recovery. They were about building something new, something stronger than before. "Ready to head up?" Alexander asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Sarah nodded, taking one last look around the winter garden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new stories of recovery. But for now, in this peaceful moment, with her family, everything was exactly as it should be. Spring arrived in London with a burst of color and promise, transforming the Blackwood Rehabilitation Centre's gardens into a canvas of blooming flowers and fresh greenery. The centre had been operating for 3 months now, and its success had exceeded even Sarah's most optimistic expectations. On this particular morning, Sarah stood in her office watching a young patient take his first unassisted steps in the winter garden. Emma sat nearby, offering encouragement, while Winston and his new companion, Luna, supervised from their favorite sunny spot. A knock at the door drew her attention. "Come in," she called, turning to find Alexander with a familiar-looking envelope in his hand. "Special delivery," he said, his voice strong and clear. "From the Medical Research Board." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They'd submitted their comprehensive study on integrated rehabilitation techniques months ago, documenting everything from Alexander's groundbreaking recovery to the center's latest successes. "Well?" she asked, noting his barely contained smile. "They want to implement our methods nationwide," he revealed, passing her the letter. "Your methods, Sarah. They're calling it the Mitchell Protocol." Sarah sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. The protocol she'd developed while caring for Alexander would now help countless patients across the country. "There's more," Alexander continued, pulling out another document. "Remember that experimental treatment Helena wanted me to try?" Sarah nodded. During their confrontation, Helena had pushed for a risky experimental procedure, claiming it was Alexander's only hope for recovery. "Research results published yesterday," he said, laying the paper on her desk. "Treatment proved dangerous. Several adverse reactions. Your gentle approach saved me from that too." Sarah remembered those early days when everyone had pushed for aggressive interventions. Her insistence on starting with basic rehabilitation and gradually building strength had seemed conservative at the time. "We should celebrate," she suggested, standing to embrace him. "Call the family together?" Alexander's eyes twinkled. "Already arranged. Emma's bringing takeaway. No cooking experiments tonight." They shared a laugh, remembering their daughter's latest culinary adventure, a well-intentioned but rather alarming attempt at French cuisine. That evening, their family gathered in the apartment above the center. Emma had indeed brought takeaway from their favorite Italian restaurant, and Mrs. Harris joined them, having become an honorary family member over the months. As they enjoyed their meal, Emma shared exciting news about her university acceptance. She'd be studying occupational therapy at a prestigious London program, allowing her to continue her involvement with the center while pursuing her degree. "I've been thinking," Emma said, helping herself to more pasta, "about what you always say, Mum, how rehabilitation isn't just about physical recovery." Sarah nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Well, I've designed a new program for the center," Emma explained, pulling out her ever-present sketchbook. "Art therapy sessions, but combined with physical therapy. Patients can express themselves while working on motor skills." Alexander examined the proposal with obvious pride. "Brilliant idea. We'll implement it next month." Mrs. Harris dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "I remember when you first arrived, Miss Mitchell. Now look at all this. A whole family changing lives together." Sarah reached for Alexander's hand under the table, feeling the steady strength of his grip. How far they'd come from those first uncertain days in the mansion. Later that night, after Emma and Mrs. Harris had gone home, Sarah and Alexander stood in the winter garden. The space had become their favorite retreat, a perfect blend of Emma's design vision and their shared dreams for the center. "Remember that first morning?" Sarah asked softly. "When I walked into the mansion?" Alexander pulled her close. "Best day of my life, though I couldn't show it." "You've come so far," she murmured, touching his face gently. "We've come far," he corrected. "Together." Through the glass ceiling, stars twinkled in the clear spring sky. Winston and Luna curled together on a nearby bench, their purring a gentle soundtrack to the peaceful moment. "The wedding's next week," Sarah said, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her voice. "Are you sure you want such a public ceremony? The media's still interested in our story." Alexander smiled. "Let them come. Show world what real recovery looks like, what love can build." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, new opportunities to help others find their way back to life. But tonight, in this quiet moment, she simply treasured how far they'd come and the beautiful future they were building together. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the June sun warming the rehabilitation center's gardens, where chairs had been arranged in neat rows. White roses and lavender created a natural aisle, their fragrance mixing with the early summer breeze. Sarah stood at her window, watching the final preparations below. Emma flitted between the guests, resplendent in her maid-of-honor dress, making sure everything was perfect. Mrs. Harris supervised the catering team with her usual efficiency, while Winston and Luna, wearing matching blue ribbons, observed the proceedings from their favorite garden bench. A soft knock announced Dr. Wellington's arrival. He'd become a strong supporter of the center after seeing its success, and Sarah had asked him to walk her down the aisle. "Ready?" he asked, taking in her elegant cream silk dress. The medical board representatives have arrived. They're quite excited about implementing the Mitchell protocol across their networks. Sarah smoothed her dress, touching the sapphire pendant that matched her engagement ring. "It still feels surreal sometimes," she admitted. "All of this growing from one patient's recovery. Not just any patient," Dr. Wellington smiled, "and not just any nurse. You two rewrote the book on rehabilitation therapy." The ceremony itself was everything they'd hoped for, intimate despite the presence of media and medical dignitaries. Alexander stood tall and proud at the altar, his voice clear and strong as he spoke his vows. Sarah's heart swelled as she watched, Emma beaming from her place beside them, their unlikely family finally becoming official. During the reception, held in the center's winter garden, Alexander clinked his glass for attention. The room fell silent as he stood, steady and confident. "1 year ago," he began, his speech flowing naturally now, "I was trapped in darkness. Sarah didn't just help me recover physically. She showed me new purpose. Together, with Emma's creativity and everyone's support, we've built something extraordinary." He gestured to the center around them. "This place represents second chances, new beginnings. Today we celebrate not just our marriage, but the power of hope, determination, and love to transform lives." Sarah stood to join him, adding her own thoughts. "When I first walked into the Blackwood mansion, I was just a nurse hoping to help one patient. Now we're helping hundreds, with more centers planned across the country. But more importantly, we found family." Emma stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "And I found a home. Not just a place to live, but a purpose. Watching you two rebuild lives every day, it inspired my own path." The celebration continued into the evening. Patients from the center joined the festivities, their presence a testament to the success of Sarah's methods. One young woman, who'd arrived unable to walk, danced with her father for the first time since her accident. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the glass ceiling, Alexander led Sarah to a quiet corner of the garden. Winston and Luna followed, settling nearby as if standing guard. "Happy?" he asked softly, holding her close. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied, watching Emma laugh with a group of young patients she'd befriended during her volunteer work. "Centers expanding," Alexander mused. "Board-approved new wing, pediatric rehabilitation." Sarah smiled. "Emma's already designing it, isn't she?" Complete with therapy cats, one for each floor, they shared a quiet laugh, remembering how it all began with one Russian blue cat and a leap of faith. The evening wound down gradually, stars appearing one by one above the glass ceiling. Guests departed with hope in their hearts, inspired by the living proof that miracles were possible with enough dedication and love. Later, in the peace of their apartment above the center, Sarah and Alexander stood at their window, looking out over the illuminated gardens below. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, new opportunities to help others find their way back to life. But tonight was for them, for celebrating how far they'd come and the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Emma joined them, Winston and Luna at her heels. "The center's just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked thoughtfully. "There's so much more we can do to help people." Alexander wrapped an arm around each of them. "Together," he said simply. Sarah leaned into their embrace, feeling the strength of their united purpose. From that first, uncertain morning to this moment of triumph and joy, their journey had been about more than recovery. It had been about building something extraordinary from life's greatest challenges. As the city lights twinkled below and stars shone above, Sarah knew that while their story might seem like a fairy tale to some, it was built on something far more powerful: the human capacity for healing, hope, and love. In the end, that was the greatest rehabilitation story of all.